My name is Daniel Serwer. I'm Vice President for Peace and Stability Operations here at U.S. Institute of Peace, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this plenary session on Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Each of these countries presents difficult challenges, and we'll be addressing Iran and Afghanistan at separate sessions. But the four countries are also intimately intertwined, with obvious and not so obvious linkages and trade-offs among them. How should we America, we the international community, approach this tangle of issues? What should take priority? Which military and civilian resources need to be brought to bear? What do we have to do right away, and what can we postpone? How can burdens be shared between America and others? All of us who have served in government know how difficult it is to focus the instruments of national and international power on even one problem. To get the balance right among four of them is going to be an enormous challenge for the Obama administration. But for the next hour, the challenge belongs to three gentlemen who are admirably well equipped for the task. Unfortunately, Admiral Mullen could not be with us today, had something urgent that came up, and we have taken the liberty, in the spirit of our times, of substituting for Admiral Mullen an Iraqi. This is part of the shift you're noticing with the sofa. And that Iraqi is Muwafaq al-Rubai, who is the National Security Advisor of Iraq, and we're very pleased to have him here with us. Ambassador Brahimi, who I think is sitting still at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, brings to the problems of Southwest Asia half a century of diplomatic experience and service to the UN and to his native Algeria. And Zbigniew Brzezinski of CSIS and Johns Hopkins is one of America's most distinguished students and practitioners of international security, national and international security. Gentlemen, please give us your wisdom. We'll start with Mr. Brzezinski.
Ladies and gentlemen, as our chairman said, the problems of Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan are interrelated, and that is true. But it is also a fact that each of these problems requires a distinctive approach and a specific U.S. policy, even though that policy is shaped in the context of the recognition that these problems are interrelated. These problems, however, could become a single problem and pose comprehensive policy challenges for the United States if they all became linked in the only fashion in which they could become linked, which is in the event of an American-Iranian war. If there was an American-Iranian war, we would indeed be dealing with a single policy issue. And it is an issue which I would prefer not to confront. For such a war would involve the United States in a conflict that would then be spanning, in different degrees of intensity, these four countries, with a total population of approximately 300 million people. I mention this quite deliberately because it seems to me that in thinking seriously about the problems of this region, one has to be very conscious of the consequences of one's actions. It is a lesson which I hope we have learned. Nonetheless, it is a fact that if we deal constructively with the specific four aspects of this larger complex of issues, we can make progress. So let me speak then specifically to each of the four, though recognizing the dynamic and interactive character of the interrelationship between them. With Iraq, we have now terminated the debate over whether there should or should not be a fixed date for U.S. disengagement. Even though those who have advocated a fixed date for U.S. disengagement have been criticized over the years as engaging in a risky undertaking, the currently departing administration itself has agreed on a date through the SOFA agreement. And the difference between it and the president-elect is less than a year. So we are settled on the notion of departure. But a military departure alone does not resolve the problems of Iraq, which will have to be handled by Iraqis themselves. But it also requires, in addition, dealing with the problems of the region. And thus, I do think that once the new administration takes office, it will be desirable to undertake serious regional consultations with all of Iraq's neighbors regarding the security consequences of U.S. disengagement and the implications of such for them. And that means a serious effort to engage in a dialogue with Iran, with Turkey, with Syria, with Jordan. I think that it is important, Saudi Arabia too, and it is important that this dialogue be conducted preparatory to the final disengagement. If we do so, we can perhaps create at least an incipient regional security approach or consensus regarding the consequences of American disengagement, mitigating some of the possible dislocations that may ensue thereafter. And what is important, we will indirectly be beginning a serious dialogue with Iran. For the bilateral American-Iranian issues cannot be entirely disentangled from regional security issues. And if there is a dialogue on the security issues pertaining to Iraq, there is the beginning of a serious American-Iranian dialogue, which in turn can facilitate what will then be increasingly necessary, and which is serious negotiations about the nuclear problem. We haven't had such negotiations for a very simple reason. The United States has insisted that the initiation of negotiations be preceded by Iran satisfying U.S. demands for preconditions that need to be met. And the key precondition happens to involve the central issue of the intended negotiations. The precondition has been that Iran has to suspend enrichment, which is the issue that needs to be negotiated. Hence, negotiations without preconditions or with mutual concessions in advance facilitating the negotiating process, in which case there could be an Iranian suspension of enrichment in return for U.S. suspension of some sanctions. In either case, such negotiations are needed. And they ought to be conducted in an atmosphere that is conducive to serious negotiations, which means not in the context of threats, because threats are not helpful to serious negotiations. And in the case of Iran, they have the effect of fusing Iranian nationalism with Iranian fundamentalism, thereby contributing to a more intransigent Iranian posture. We have to be also careful in how we deal with the issue of possible sanctions if Iran remains unwilling to accommodate. And of course, it is necessary to consider additional sanctions, but again in a fashion that doesn't poison the atmosphere of the negotiations themselves, and there's always a delicate relationship between advancing a negotiating process and creating an atmosphere in which the advancement is possible, but without unrealistic expectations that one side alone will make the concessions. If we do this with Iran, we may also be able, if there is progress, to benefit from a more helpful Iranian posture regarding the problem of Afghanistan. And it is useful to recall that late in 2001 and in the course of 2002, Iran was at that time very helpful to the United States in dealing with the problems of Afghanistan. Insofar as Afghanistan itself is concerned, it is my view that the United States has to be very deliberate in avoiding the mistakes that the Soviet Union made in Afghanistan. The Soviets came into Afghanistan on the illusion that they could create in Afghanistan a replica of a Soviet-type state with the help of Afghan Marxists sympathetic to the Soviet Union. They discovered, not long after their intervention, that that help of the Afghan Marxists had limited political benefit and enjoyed little domestic support, while the presence of Soviet troops in Afghanistan increasingly galvanized a nationwide opposition, violent opposition, to the Soviet occupation, which in the end even 160,000 Soviet troops could not crush, while devastating much of Afghanistan. When we entered Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11, we were greeted by most Afghans because we had helped them in the resistance to the Soviets. And thus, we could accomplish what we did with practically no major military deployment, a total of 300 special forces, plus air power. Today, we're engaged in a more serious military engagement in which more than 50,000 troops are engaged, mostly US, but also NATO contingents. This runs the risk of gradually turning the Afghan population against our efforts and of isolating those democratic Afghans in Kabul on whom we have been relying to create the opposite of a Soviet-type state, but a modern nation-state based on democratic principles. The enterprise, thus paradoxically, is turning in a direction painfully reminiscent of what the Soviets experienced. It is therefore my view that while we may have to deploy some additional forces to deal with the specific problems in specific regions of Afghanistan, the real emphasis is needed. The real emphasis should be put on a strategy of seeking decentralized political accommodation with those elements of the Taliban that are not committed to the more global terroristic aspirations of al-Qaeda, but are focused more specifically on domestic Afghan concerns, elements which have a view of society very alien to us, one that we instinctively and naturally repudiate, but views which do not represent by themselves the kind of threat that al-Qaeda has imposed on the United States. If local accommodations with different Taliban groups are possible, in which any al-Qaeda presence is eliminated by the Taliban, I think an accommodation based on that formula could also permit some local disengagement by the United States. Such an approach would also help us avoid becoming entangled into a further aspect of the Afghan problem, which has the potential of bogging us down ever more deeply, and that is conflict essentially involving the Pashtun elements of Afghan society that also involve significant segments of Pakistani society. of the 40 or so million Pashtuns living in the area, 14 million live in Afghanistan, representing close to half the population. 26 million live in Pakistan. And the frontier dividing the two components of the Pashtun people, the Afghan and the Pakistani, is a completely artificial line drawn by the British. Thus, a conflict involving the Pashtuns draws us into ever more deeply into the problems of Pakistan. I think it is very important for the United States to realize that we have neither the political understanding nor the physical, military, or political means to resolve the problems of Afghanistan. And getting drawn into these problems ever more deeply is an undertaking which does not bode a good outcome. In brief, I think we have to rethink comprehensively how we deal with the interrelated but distinctive problems posed before us by the challenges that we face in Iraq, in Iran, and in Afghanistan. We have to do so with the understanding that in the long run, it is important for the United States not to become politically and militarily drawn into a conflict from which there may be then no easy exit. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Brahimi.
Thank you very much indeed. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today, but it is also somewhat intimidating to be speaking after Dr. Brzezinski. I'm also very happy to share the platform of Dr. Muwafaq Rubai, whom I haven't seen for quite some time since our days in Baghdad. I agree with Dr. Brzezinski that Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, in whichever order you wish to take them, are all extremely important countries in what might be called an expanding Middle East, and will undoubtedly be competing for pride of place on the agenda of the next US administration. They have much in common. There are many linkages between their problems, but again, as Dr. Brzezinski said, they are essentially different countries with different backgrounds and circumstances. The linkages are stronger between Afghanistan and Pakistan on the one hand, and between Iraq and Iran on the other. This mutual interference is particularly important in the case of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it is obvious that there shall be no peace and no stability in Afghanistan if, for whatever reason, Pakistan were to consider that the continuation of conflict and instability in Afghanistan better serves its interests. However, this is no reason to rush to the conclusion, as many have done in Kabul and elsewhere, that conflicts in Afghanistan are entirely due to Pakistan, and that therefore peace and stability.
Excuse me if I interrupt. The acoustics are bothering us up here. I don't know if they are. If you speak in the middle of these two microphones, I think it'll work better.
You will have to position me exactly in the middle so that... the mutual interference, as I said, I think many in Kabul and elsewhere have rushed to the conclusion that the conflicts in Afghanistan are entirely due to Pakistan, and that therefore peace and stability will immediately be restored if only Pakistan wills it. The reality is that Pakistan and also Iran and other countries, as a matter of fact, can fan the flames of conflict, but Pakistan alone cannot order the return of peace. Amongst the things that these four countries have in common, I see these following 3 points. One, different as their perspective problems are, in none of them are the solutions going to be military? Each and all of these problems are political, and in or with each of these countries, solutions have to be political. Second, the United States has, with each of the 4 countries, bilateral issues that need to be addressed bilaterally. This is particularly the case with Iran. But in each case, there are regional and international dimensions, and to properly address them, the United States cannot go it alone. It needs to seek the full cooperation, and they need to do it on equal terms with other players who also have legitimate interests and concerns. 3, important and legitimate as the interests and concerns of the United States and those other countries in the region and further afield are, it is indispensable in each case to give the needs and aspirations of the people of the country concerned all the attention they deserve. I, for one, strongly believe that these needs and concerns must be treated as the primary objective of any strategy if peace and stability is to return to that given country and to the region as a whole. Let me also observe that if all 4 countries have serious problems, which country in the world doesn't? Afghanistan is probably the only one where practically all the people in and outside of government recognize that their country is facing a grave internal crisis, and they cannot overcome their difficulties without the support of others. Of course, even in Afghanistan, different communities, different groups, and different individuals will have different views of what kind of help they need and from whom they would prefer to receive it. Other countries, all 3 other countries, will probably find it difficult to recognize that they have problems at all, and if they do, they will be very particular about what kind of cooperation, what kind of support, and on what conditions they would accept it. Let me say a few words about Iran, speaking as somebody who comes from the region, to see how, just to highlight how the perceptions of countries, perceptions countries have themselves differ from the perceptions that others have of them. Iran has been an important country in the region for a long time. It was so under the Shah, and it is so today. It has the war against Iraq, devastating as it was, helped actually the regime in Iran consolidate itself, and it did not prevent it from expanding its influence far and wide, particularly in Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Of the many unintended consequences of Israel's war on Lebanon in the summer of 2006, Hezbollah, which was supposed to be destroyed by that war, came out hugely reinforced, and its popularity unequaled in the Arab world, and Iran, as the supporter of Hezbollah, gained incredibly vast influence all over the region. In this connection, the Israeli policy of relentless collective punishment in Palestine, in which is reaching new heights with the brutal onslaught on Gaza now proceeding, and the support it enjoys from the United States, will do very little indeed to facilitate the settlement of any of the conflicts in the troubled region of the Middle East. But the US invasion of Iraq is seen by Iranian leaders as a truly God-sent development for their country and their regime. Not only did their big enemy, I don't dare to say the big Satan, eliminated Saddam Hussein, their biggest foe in the region, it also put in power in Baghdad Iraqi political groups, militias, and individuals that were and still are very close to Tehran. As a result, today, Iran has vastly more political clout in Baghdad than Washington does. Consequently, Iraq's problems in their regional dimensions cannot be effectively addressed and solved without the participation of Iran. In Afghanistan, Iran's influence is perhaps second to that of Pakistan and may barely equal that of India. There is little doubt, however, that the Islamic Republic has the means to seriously obstruct any peace project it sees as detrimental to its national interest or regional agenda. Of the nuclear file, I know far too little to say anything of interest, except perhaps that Iran does seem to be within its legal rights in acting as it does, and that in the entire region, if some governments may have some concerns about Iran's nuclear program, at the popular level, there is very widespread support for everything Iran does or intends to do. As for Iraq, I think I will, now that we have an authoritative voice from Baghdad, I will leave the important things to say about Iraq to him. I will say, however, that, as I think indicated that the government in Iraq, understandably, demands to be recognized and treated as the legitimate, democratically elected government of the land, and would resist any offer of external help, especially in the political field, unless they are put in firm and sole control. Violence has definitely diminished in a remarkable, even spectacular way in 2008, and that is most welcome. However, the cost of the past 7 years has been staggering. The brutal ethnic cleansing that has taken place in Baghdad and most Iraqi cities is grossly unreported. Even more underreported is the tragic situation of minorities. The Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Canada, has just published a welcome study by Mukhtar Lamani on the issue. Christians, Turkmen, Yazidis, Faili Kurds, Mandayans, and Shabak and others all have been and are persecuted and often forced to seek refuge outside of Iraq wherever they can. It suffices to indicate that a couple of years before the invasion, there was perhaps 1.5 million Christians in Iraq. There is now less than 700,000, and more are trying to leave the country. And of course, as we know that Kirkuk remains a very, very serious bone of contention between Iraq's Arabs, Shia and Sunni, and the Kurds. As to what needs to be done, there is definitely no need to reinvent the wheel. On the two hot wars in which the United States is engaged, Iraq and Afghanistan, there is in the public domain a wealth of documents that offer comprehensive analysis and sensible recommendations. To mention just the best known, there is the report of the Iraq Study Group and the report also of the Afghanistan Study Group that was put together by the Institute for the Study of the Presidency. And there is, of course, the wealth of studies, reports, papers published by think tanks, not least this US Peace, the Institute of Peace and Crisis Group in Belgium. So there is the building blocks of what needs to be done in these two wars are already there, but they need to come together. I will I will say a few things about Afghanistan because that is the place I know best. And I think probably the same line can be followed also for Iraq. I think many here are familiar with my view that mistakes we all made in Afghanistan are largely responsible for the deterioration of the situation. The fact that the participants in Bonn were not fully representative of the rich variety of the Afghan society, the refusal to expand ISAF when the population was pleading with us to ensure its presence out of the capital, the reluctance to reach out to those who were not represented in Bonn, including the Taliban, when doing so at the time may have done a great deal to ensure national reconciliation, the waste by the international community of scarce resources, the inadequate help given to Afghan efforts to rebuild national, regional, and local institutions, the incompetence and corruption in the government at all levels, all these factors combined with the invasion of Iraq and its dire consequences, the deterioration of the internal situation in Pakistan, and the facilities enjoyed in that country by the Taliban and other insurgents, all that contributed to raise doubts, disappointments, and ultimately growing hostility towards the new authorities in Kabul and their international partners. At the end of it all, let us compare the warm welcome given by the people of Afghanistan to ISAF in the early 2002. Let's compare also the understanding clearly shown towards military action by the US and enduring freedom in those early days, and compare that with the growing rejection of both NATO and enduring freedom at present. The United Nations itself is not anymore universally accepted, and the international personnel in Kabul, UN included, is more and more closed into an Afghan version of the Green Zone in Baghdad. These worrying developments leads me to venture to ask the following, maybe somewhat controversial questions. One, considering how NATO has performed, was it a wise decision to have brought this alliance to Afghanistan in the first place? And what is to be done now about it? Two, also in hindsight, I'm inclined to say that Enduring Freedom operation has long outlived its usefulness. After all, it was launched to defeat Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and punish the Taliban, who had chosen to be their allies. By the end of 2001, those objectives had been largely achieved. The Taliban regime had collapsed, and those amongst the Al-Qaeda leaders and their foot soldiers who survived the original onslaught were flushed out of the country and, to my knowledge, have not been seen very often inside Afghanistan since. Enduring Freedom continued as part of an ill-defined global war on terror against an enemy which was not there anymore. Three, also in hindsight, I am wondering whether you still don't hear us? 2 minutes. Yeah. In hindsight, again, I am wondering whether we at the United Nations, when we were faced with a firm refusal to expand ISAF, should not have explored the possibility of establishing a full-fledged Chapter 7 United Nations peacekeeping mission to replace both ISAF and Operation Enduring Freedom. These are three important questions. I'm sure that not everybody will agree that they are the right questions to ask, but perhaps you would like to reflect about them. For sure, neither NATO nor the US see themselves as a foreign force of occupation in Afghanistan. And earlier on, at the beginning, the overwhelming majority of the people of Afghanistan did not look at them that way either. But that situation is changing, I'm afraid, and it's not the Taliban only who are now wondering if these foreign forces are friendly forces the way ISAF was in 2002 and 2003, or whether US and NATO forces are occupying forces in the same manner as the Russians were in the 1980s, or in the way the international coalition is in Iraq at present. Too many weddings and funerals have been bombed from the sky. Too many women and children have been killed. Too many young people, in some instances only kids, have been arrested and kept under total isolation in Bagram for years or sent to Guantanamo. Consequently, the alternative for these foreign forces is clear enough: to succeed in changing their image and do what it takes to convince once again the people of Afghanistan that they are not there to dominate, humiliate, or persecute, but to help rebuild the state institutions, develop the economy, and bring peace and stability for all. Short of that, they have to face the certainty of fast-growing rejection and ultimately the serious probability of military defeat at the hands of a growing national resistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Brahimi. Dr. Muwafaq al-Rumai.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me for this forum. Mr. Chairman, the original panel was meant to be not to include Iraqi, to discuss Iraq. But we Iraqis forced ourselves into this panel. This is another sign of sovereignty, and this has showed how did we negotiate the SOFA. But it's an honor and a pleasure to address this forum. And I'm in a disadvantage because I followed the two superstars, two giants, Al-Akhdar Brahimi and Dr. Brzezinski. I'll concentrate on Iraq. I would like to share some thoughts on what's Iraq now, what's Iraq yesterday, what was Iraq yesterday, what's Iraq now, and what's Iraq in future, and what are the challenges. In summer 2006, and we all remember this, we were in a deep civil war, very ugly, in a deplorable state of affairs. We were really, really in a bad shape. What brought us to that civil war is another matter. And hence the Maliki government started in summer 2006. And it was very clear to everybody that the joint strategy, or the US and Iraq strategy, which is basically transitioning from multinational forces authority of the provinces to Iraq and reduction of US forces, were not working. That strategy was failing. Now, if we compare summer 2006 with now, 18 months later, or what we have, all indicators and all measures, it shows how considerable reduction in violence and all indicator indices going down. What brought us to here? Why did we get this? We believe this is multiple factors brought this security achievement we are enjoying now. We have to identify these to sustain them. It depends on who you are asking. If you ask multinational forces, they will tell you it's the surge and the change of tactics. But I will not start with that. I will start with one thing, which is the Iraqi security forces reached to a level in quantity and quality, in a level that I call critical mass level, whereby we turned the table against the terrorists. And the Iraqi security forces reached to a level whereby they're fighting and they're planning, they're performing and carrying out security operation on their own. And more than 90% of their operations they are carrying it on their own. Because we are much more suited for this fight. We understand the terrain. We understand this country. Much more suited for this fight than any other. So that was a determining factor, I believe. The second is the rejection of this alien ideology of Al-Qaeda. Iraq is a very urbane society. It's a very sophisticated society. Al-Qaeda and its alien ideology does not fit in a slot in the Iraqi society. That's why the Sunni Arab community turned around and fought Al-Qaeda and got rid of Al-Qaeda from their provinces. And that was, call it awakening, call it Sons of Iraq, call it whatever you like to call it. But that's the essence of it. And that is another determining factor. Also, the policy of national reconciliation and national unity, which was adopted by Prime Minister Maliki and the government, which took over in summer 2006. We pursued aggressive policy of national reconciliation, including everybody, literally everybody, in that government, in the Council of Representatives, in the Council of Ministers, in the government. And also, the aggressive policy of the government of Iraq, which was pursued in reaching out to the regional power, to our neighbors, what we call regional engagement. Reaching out to Iran, reaching out to Syria, reaching out to Saudi, and reaching out to Turkey. I think that was very unpopular by some of our friends. But I think that paid the dividends now. And the violence is down now. Of course, the surge has done. It's very difficult to suss or assess how much the surge has done. But I leave this to the historians and to the analysts, to the political analysts, to be clever by retrospectively, if you like. What we have now is a considerable reduction in violence. And I was looking at some of the figures, and I compared the number of murders in Detroit now, 2 million population, to the number of murders in Basra, which is 2 million. And the number of murders in Detroit is double that of the number of murders in Basra. Iraqi security forces is taking the lead in most of the security operations. Planning, carrying out, and analyzing. Growing Iraqi government legitimacy within Iraq through the citizens, its own citizens, and in the region and in the international community. A lot of ambassadors from Arab countries, from the international country, are coming back to Iraq. And the governance also is maturing gradually but progressively. The Council of Ministers, the Council of Representatives, and even the individual ministries are delivering better, marginally better services with capacity building growing up. Iraq now is fully sovereign country, especially after the no United Nations Security Council imposing any mandate on Iraq, and Iraq is out of Chapter 7. Imagine even the United States government is recognizing Iraq as a sovereign state. So Iraq is increasingly secure, democratic, and strategic partner to the United States. The challenges are numerous. The most important challenge is from within. On our democracy is the Ba'ath ideology, is the Ba'athist ideology, not the Ba'athists as individuals. Probably 99.9% recurring of them, they are innocent people. They were after their lives, after salaries. But the Ba'athist ideology is very dangerous for Iraq, because this is a Nazi ideology. This is a plotting, conspiring ideology. This is an ideology that does not understand ballot boxes, understand coup d'etat. The Ba'ath ideology is like a genetic makeup called, a genes called Ba'athism, a genes called coup d'etat. You cannot change it. And we need to have a very detailed strategy towards that. Also, one of the challenges, we need to develop our institutions, ministries, and develop our Iraqi security forces. Iraqi security forces, I cannot claim that they are 100% professional security forces. We have some problems in there. We need to do a lot of work there. We need also to do a lot of work in creating a democratic culture through elections, referendum, and so on and so forth. And you saw in the last 11 months of debating the SOFA and the Council of Representatives how lively the discussion was. I have a message to deliver here. Bush era in Iraq was liberation, security, security, security. Obama era should be strategic relationship, more holistic relationship, economy, education, cultural, scientific, religious relationship with the United States. We need to cement this strategic relationship with the United States so that we will firmly say, and hand on heart saying, that Iraq is firmly, with concrete feet, heading west, flying west. And we need to consolidate, disengage militarily, disengage in security. We have no problem. We have a roadmap towards that called the SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement. Very clear. It has a lifespan of 3 years. It expires in 31st of December 2011. But we need to work out an implementation plan to implement the strategic framework agreement immediately and lay down the foundation for a strategic partnership. You will have a democratic, strong partner in the region. Democratic partner. Remember, democratic partner. You might have other partners, but democratic partner is unique for Iraq, I believe. If there is one thing you want to remember from me, forget everything I said. Everything I said is not relevant. One thing is relevant, I believe. I'm here to deliver one message to the people of the United States of America, to the American people. A big, big, big thank you for everything you've done for Iraq, for liberating Iraq, for sustaining this liberation and fighting terrorism and sustaining the security gains we are enjoying now. in helping building our democratic institutions, in helping building our Iraqi security forces. So big thank you to the United States of America. We need to move on from one era, from one phase of the last 6 years to another phase of a long-lasting, durable, enduring relationship with the United States of America. That's what we are looking for. And that's what the challenge for the new administration. Disengagement in security is one thing, but do not disengage from Iraq in all aspects. Otherwise, the treasure and the blood and the sweat and the tears you have invested in Iraq will go down the drain. And I don't think anybody wanted this to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think I deserve a round of applause from you at the end of my speech, but I wanted you to give a big, big, big round of applause to those who sacrificed their life in Iraq for liberation, for democracy, and for liberating 30 million people and helping for the young men and women from the United States of America, from the coalition, from the multinational forces, and Iraqis who paid heavily as well in their lives. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much to all three of our panelists. Thank you very much to all three of our panelists, and in particular to Moafaq for his last remarks. I'm going to open the floor to questions. We'll have time for one or two. While people are getting ready to raise their hands, that's what you have to do, is raise your hands or stand up if you want to ask a question. I would just note a couple of things about the presentations we've heard. One is that the good news came from Iraq, which is a bit of a surprise for many of us. Secondly, I note that though they come from very different perspectives, there are some common themes in the presentations we've heard. The importance of neighbors to stabilizing a country, the importance of local ownership in local institutions, the importance of combining diplomatic and military instruments, the importance of international legitimacy. It seems to me that you've heard three people who come at things from very different angles, but who have some basic principles in common. A question from the floor. Trudy, please. Introduce yourself, Trudy.
Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer. We heard Dr. Rubai talk about how Iraqis took on the fight against al-Qaeda, and with some help from the surge, the critical element was Iraqis doing the heavy lifting. I wanted to ask Dr. Brzezinski and Mr. Brahimi, do you see a way in Iraq where those extra troops could fulfill the same function in making it possible for Afghans themselves and for Pakistanis in the Fatah to turn against violent actors who are oppressing them?
Please, Mr. Brzezinski.
It seems to me that the situations are quite different. In the case of Iraq, we undertook to remove an obnoxious regime from power, but in the process, we also generated an insurgency directed against us, and also the appearance of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had not been there prior to the US military undertaking. The military outcome in Iraq that has now emerged in the final analysis is the accomplishment of US forces. While I certainly respect the contribution made in more recent times by the Iraqi forces, the fundamental outcome is the product of the overwhelming power of the United States, which deployed 150,000 troops with the most modern equipment and engaged in intensive combat to achieve the results that we're now beginning to witness. In the case of Afghanistan, we're dealing with a society which is less accessible, less advanced, intensely xenophobic, initially not hostile to the American presence, but over time increasingly uneasy and then hostile towards it. I think our task in Afghanistan is not to wage the war to a successful military outcome, but to accommodate to the reality that Afghanistan is a pre-modern society. It is not likely to have a modern state superimposed upon a pre-modern society, and that it is therefore in our interest to find those accommodations which are more feasible on the local or regional levels. Last but not least, in Afghanistan, those who are contesting us are not linked directly to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had a presence in Afghanistan, but Taliban was not an active ally of Al-Qaeda in its strikes against the United States or against other countries, particularly in Europe. Thus, separating the Taliban from Al-Qaeda, in my judgment, is a feasible and a potentially productive political objective.
Ambassador Brahimi?
I agree with what Dr. Brzezinski has just said. Perhaps add that Afghan society has changed a great deal. It is very much urbanized, much more urbanized today than it was when the Russians were there. And therefore, society is changing there, and the possibility over time of creating a functioning state is definitely there. The problem of the foreigners there, as Dr. Brzezinski said, is that when in 2001, when the Americans arrived, when ISAF came, when we all went there, we were not seen as an occupying force by practically anybody. Today, more and more people, and that is not Taliban, and it's not only the Taliban, are wondering what are these forces. It was reported to me that President Karzai has told some of his people that people don't understand. People understand that I cannot protect them against Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. They cannot understand that I cannot protect them against my allies, the foreign forces here, who are killing, bombarding weddings and funerals and so on. So the question is there, whether you increase the forces or not, that I don't know. The military people will tell you what to do. What needs to be done is for the Americans and their allies there, together working with the Afghan government, they have got to convince the people of Afghanistan that they are not their enemies and they are not an occupying force. And that is doable.
Thank you very much. Let me take one more right here.
Jonathan Broder from Congressional Quarterly. I'd like to address this question to Mr. Rubai. Sir, you spoke of the need to strengthen Iraq's democracy through elections. And we've got the provincial elections in Iraq coming up at the very end of this month. How confident are you that those elections will go smoothly, that there is enough security to protect the polling stations, and that the results of those elections will reflect the will of the people and not the will of the major parties?
Dr. Rubai.
Thank you very much. We have had a good experience in protecting the ballot boxes through the first general election in January 2005, then the referendum in October 2005, and then the general election at the end of 2005. So we have this track record of the Iraqi security forces have good experience in protecting this to ensure that this is a fair and free election. But there are encouraging signs in this new election. Number one, it's going to be much more representative because the Sunni Arab community would be given a very good chance of choosing their local leaders and provincial councils and their governors. And this is for the first time because the last time, well, 3 years ago or 3.5 years ago, they have boycotted this. This is number one. Number two, there are two options now. Either you have a closed list or an open list. And there is an option for you to elect a particular individual rather than a list. Number three, I think it's extremely important. Now, the discussion and the debate in the media now is issue-based politics rather than sectarian-based. See, I think this is a huge paradigm shift from the old sectarian politics, ethnic politics. I'm not saying that we have moved 100% to the other side, that's nationalist political program, but I'm saying this, there are very good early signs that we are talking now about issue politics. We're talking about federalism or central government as opposed to the central government, to centralized system. We're talking about providing services. We're talking about corruption. We're talking about, there are a lot of issues now being discussed in the local election, not sectarian, not ethnic. Well, Kurdistan is not included in the provincial election, but there are no sectarian politics in this provincial election. I think this is extremely encouraging. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking the panel.